Fentanyl. It could be hiding anywhere, including in your house, including in your medicine cabinet, or maybe at a friend's house when you're hanging out, playing games, and get offered a pill. Don't take chances. If a drug didn't come from a pharmacy directly to you, you can find fentanyl using a simple strip you can pick up at your local pharmacy. Don't take it until you test it, because fentanyl can be hiding anywhere. Brought to you by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Disabilities.
We're all used to hearing, don't eat this, definitely don't eat that, eat less of this, avoid that. But what if one of those things to be avoided was actually good for you in some cases? You're listening to the Health Courage Collective podcast, episode 156, Eat More Starch. Welcome to the Health Courage Collective podcast, the show for women who are too busy to slog through hours of generalized, inapplicable, and often contradictory health information, but too smart to ignore that a few minutes of focused attention now can prevent years of suffering in the future. I'm your host, Christina Hackett, a pharmacist who doesn't want you to live on prescriptions, a certified coach specifically trained to maximize your potential, and a compulsive learner obsessed with preventative, cutting-edge, holistic, and integrative medicine. I'm on a mission to increase your physical and mental resilience so you can fearlessly look forward to your next 40-plus limitless years. Your time is now. Let's go. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode. I'm so happy to spend a few minutes with you today. I hope you're doing great. How is your uncertainty? Have you thought of ways to improve your relationship with uncertainty so you can create an exciting future that you can look forward to? Today we're going to talk about food we've often been made to feel is bad. Starch. We know that too much sugar eaten too frequently prevents our cells from being able to function at their highest level. That is true. And starch turns into sugar pretty quickly depending on a few things like how much it has been processed. So, as a general rule, I do think that you will age more powerfully if you don't overdo it with sugars and starches. But is it possible that some tasty starches could actually be good for you? It's an appealing idea, and I think that the answer is yes. But why would we want to eat foods that turn into sugar in our bloodstream? Because, as I always say, we're healthiest when we're not eating just for ourselves, but we're eating for our puppet masters who control our experience of life. Do you remember who they are? We talked all about them in episode 139, so if you missed that one, you might want to go back and listen to all the ways that our life and health are dictated by our bacteria. And there's a particular kind of starch that feeds a few strains of bacteria that can help keep you strong, energetic, and feeling younger for longer. Diet debaters or experts or whatever you call them often argue about what's missing from the modern diet. It's animal protein. No, it's the protein from organ meats. It's fat. No, it's just the omega fats that are found in grass-fed animals versus feedlot animals. Okay, yeah, maybe, but could it be a special kind of starch? It makes sense to me that we evolved to thrive on the foods that were naturally available to us when we were like hunting and gathering, and not in the pantry hunting and gathering Oreos and gummy bears. Joel Green is a nutrition coach whose approach makes a lot of sense to me. He likes to talk a lot about ancestral diets and how if we eat these ancestral type foods in an ancestral pattern, we'll naturally optimize our gut microbiome and by extension, our health and longevity. Our ancestors ate a lot of carbs, which is not what we're led to believe by a lot of paleo-type media coverage, but studies of dental calculus from 80,000-year-old humans show that a central part of their diet was starch from roots, tubers, and acorns. Starch from foraging foods, the kinds you eat when you're gathering through the forest as you're hunting but haven't successfully killed an animal in a while, is superfood for the guys you really need to be concerned with feeding, your friendly bacteria. Our ancestors didn't eat based on preference most of the time. They just ate whatever they could find. So variety and diversity were forced upon them and also probably benefited them. The rhythm of foraging, fasting, and then occasionally feasting was what kept them and their gut linings and the bacteria who lived there healthy. These special starches that feed our bacteria rather than us are called resistant starches because they resist digestion by us. They go through our stomach and small intestines where most nutrients are absorbed and reach our large intestine undigested. Resistant starches are then fermented by the bacteria there, feeding the bacteria and allowing them to proliferate, and also producing short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are what keep the cells in the lining of our gut fully functional and tightly linked together. A high-functioning gut lining reduces incidence of allergies and autoimmune conditions, reduces chronic inflammation, and improves immune system functioning, and even reduces blood pressure and plasma cholesterol levels. People who eat resistant starches have been shown to have 32% higher rates of fat oxidation and 18% lower carbohydrate oxidation after a meal than those who eat regular starch, meaning that they burn more fat and metabolize fewer carbs if their starch is resistant versus digestible. Resistant starches also stimulate GLP-1, at least in rodents. GLP-1 is what's stimulated by semaglutide, Ozempic, Wegovy, etc., those blockbuster weight loss drugs that you can't get away from hearing about right now. Resistant starch plays a role in naturally stimulating satiety and blood sugar control via endogenous GLP-1 production, the GLP-1 that we naturally make ourselves. There's a blood marker called TMAO that we don't need to get into, but high levels are associated with cardiovascular disease, and studies have shown that lower levels of resistant starch in the diet are associated with higher levels of TMAO. Some diets, like a sustained very high protein diet and a sustained very high fat diet, can damage the gut lining over time. Adding resistant starch decreases the gut wall damage from those diets. Obviously, cycling periods of extremism or eating in a more natural rhythm would help that even more. I like Joel Green's perspective, which is that eating over a period of weeks or months or more is an entire system that needs to be evaluated altogether, and that the good has a way of balancing out the bad. So a lot of what we think of as bad is because we're not taking a broad enough view of how all the elements interact with one another and the way our body systems function. Several studies have attempted to estimate the amount of resistant starch our ancestors consumed on a daily basis, and the estimated range is 30 to 400 grams per day. That's a pretty big range. What is clear, though, is that they ate significantly more than modern humans do. I personally don't think it's the only ancestrally optimized thing that can help us put more years lived in good health into our future, but I do believe that it's one of them. And adding resistant starch back to your diet is pretty easy and enjoyable. There are 4 types of resistant starch classified by their structure, and more than one type of resistant starch can be present in a single food. Typically, with normal digestible starch, our body breaks it down and we get individual molecules such as glucose from it, and we can use that glucose for energy. With resistant starches, we can't do that. RS1 is found in seed coats of plants and plant babies, so seeds, nuts, legumes, and whole grains. Resistant starch 2 is in raw foods that we normally cook, but when they're raw, it's not broken down at all and provides no caloric energy to us, but they will feed our gut bacteria. Resistant starch 3 is a kind of starch present in some foods that have been cooked and then cooled. The cooling forms little crystals of RS3. Tubers, rice, barley, beans, and maybe some other stuff that I'm not aware of. When they're cooked and warm, we can absorb the starches like usual. But once they've been cooled, the water leaves the helix structure of amylose and pectin and tightens up, and our amylase enzymes can no longer break into that structure to break it down into something we could absorb like glucose. So we can no longer digest that starch. But our gut bacteria can, and they love it. RS4 is a chemical form that, to my knowledge, doesn't exist in naturally occurring food. We know we can't digest them, but our gut bacteria can, but we don't know what other effects they might have on our bodies. Some foods, like lentils, have a resistant starch content of about 4% if they're cooked and then cooled to at least room temperature. 4% isn't a lot, so you have to decide the pros and cons of eating that food in general, both for you and for your gut bacteria. You can also directly take resistant starches like raw potato starch, which would be RS2 because it's raw, but that can pose its own problems if you have dysbiosis or suboptimal gut bacteria to start with, especially overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, which is SIBO. Generally, you have almost no bacteria in the small intestine. That's a discussion for another time. But if you have a pretty normal gut biome, typically these resistant starches can't get broken down and digested, so they travel intact to the large intestine, where your friendly gut bacteria feast on them and produce for you butyrate, which feeds the lining of your GI tract, and you a little bit. You get some calorie energy from it, and it does some other really cool things. Other short-chain fatty acids besides butyrate are conjugated linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fat that benefits your body, and maleic acid, which helps burn fat and increase lean muscle mass. Those byproducts of bacterial fermentation are produced by different strains of bacteria. There is probably some benefit to getting some RS1 and RS2 and RS3 because they feed different strains of bacteria that produce different short-chain fatty acids that help us become awesome in different ways. And it's probably beneficial to get your resistant starches along with some regular insoluble fiber, like roughage, meaning from actual food in its natural form. When we're talking about feeding the bacteria that we want to live in us, there are kind of 5 main types of prebiotics, if you will, the stuff that feeds the friendly bacteria. The first is the color pigments in darkly colored foods. We talked all about them in episode 106. These polyphenols feed good bacteria, including bifidobacteria, lactobacillus, and Akkermansia strains. Believe it or not, dairy is the next category of products. You certainly don't have to ingest them if you're sensitive to them, but the oligosaccharides, galacto-oligosaccharides, and lactose are broken down by some good gut bacteria. Next is whole grains, not the kind printed on hyper-processed foods like breakfast cereal, but actual grains in their whole form that have beta-glucans, fructooligosaccharides, and arabinoxylans that feed good bacteria. Next, I'm sure you can guess, is cruciferous and inulin vegetables. They contain cellulose, which is an insoluble fiber, hemicellulose, pectin, lignans, glucosinolates, and inulin, which is a great prebiotic. Then there's resistant starch, which we're talking about today. I'm going to add a 6th one, which I believe to be true, which is collagen. We talked about collagen in episode 78, so that's a good one to go back to and listen to. But collagen actually feeds some of the good bacteria in your gut that keep your gut healthy and with the proper amounts of mucus. Gut expert Grace Liu suggests that eating RS2 starches from raw foods that we normally cook, this would be raw potato starch, raw rice starch, raw tapioca starch, raw maize starch, and etc., feed animal bifidobacteria strains more than human strains and Bacteroides strains, which are both good and bad, but too much of them is bad. So your main regular resistant starch consumption should probably be RS3, which is also the easiest and most delicious kind to find. Foods you might have thought were bad that contain resistant starches are rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes, legumes, lentils, root vegetables, semi-green bananas, chickpeas, black beans, sprouted grains, oats, and barley. Here's the important thing though, don't miss this. If you're multitasking, hear this. The rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, oats, and barley need to be cooked and then cooled before you eat them to get the benefit of the resistant starch. So you can enjoy some of these starches that you probably like anyway, guilt-free, if you cool them down before you eat them. Cool them to at least room temperature or more. Fridge temperature is fine. You can eat them cold if you want to, but you can also reheat them and the resistant starch stays there. Magic. So that's my challenge to you. Try to reap the benefits of resistant starches more. And the way to do this is, if you're going to eat a banana anyway, choose a semi-green banana. If you're going to eat a potato, sweet potato, black beans, rice, lentils, oats, or barley anyway, cook it early enough to cool it down to at least room temperature. Then you can reheat it before you eat it if you want to. Same with black beans and garbanzo beans, but if you get them from a can, they've already been cooked and cooled. I don't really care about rice, it's not bad, but if you told me I could never eat it again for the rest of my life, I wouldn't be sad at all. But I've always loved rice pudding for some reason. My mom called it rice mush. My mom's from Sweden, and when there was leftover rice from dinner, she'd put it in the fridge overnight and then make Swedish rice mush for breakfast in the morning. I didn't like the dinner rice, but I loved the breakfast rice. You recook it with milk till it gets kind of porridgey and then sprinkle cinnamon sugar on it. If it's Christmas Eve, you put an almond in the pot, and whoever finds the almond in their rice mush will be the next one to get married. Little did I know that my preference for cooled and reheated rice was giving me a little bit of resistant starch. I've also always loved oatmeal, but stopped eating it quite a few years ago because I decided it was too carby. But I think I'm going to make myself a big pot of steel-cut oats and cool it in individual bowls so I can have one a few times a month. These foods are all starchy, so you don't want to be eating tons of them all the time, but having some resistant starch along for the ride is beneficial. So eating them cooked and then cooled on occasion is a good idea if you want a healthy population of gut buddies. And you do. The resistant starches help sensitize you to insulin, help you feel fuller, help your gut bacteria make more short-chain fatty acids that improve the health of your gut and maybe even prevent constipation, reduce your risk for colon cancer, and decrease your cholesterol. Resistant starches are usually fermented slowly, so it can potentially cause less gas and bloating than adding other types of fiber to your diet. But it still is possible that adding resistant starch, if you're not used to it, can cause some gas and bloating, so go slowly at first. I think it's a lot less likely with eating cooked and cooled rice, potatoes, and oats than it would be if you were using scoopfuls of raw tapioca starch or something. Just be aware that there are generally repercussions of some kind whenever you do something drastic. And if you have any GI issues like IBS or even acid reflux, be extra careful with any changes that you make. As always, I think it's wise to focus first on getting the optimal amounts of protein and the optimal amounts of energy and on your regular insoluble fiber and the polyphenols and vitamins in your food first. Adding a bunch of resistant starches to a diet with suboptimally high amounts of processed foods and or simple carbohydrates won't be your highest leverage move. But if you feel like you've got those things fairly dialed in and you're wondering what to have for lunch tomorrow, especially if, like me, you've thought that oatmeal and rice and potatoes are bad, maybe you could consider a resistant starch meal a couple times a week. I do it for lunch on Mondays and some Wednesdays, ideally. Aside from raw potato starch, plantain powder, and powdered Jerusalem artichoke, the real foods you can get some resistant starch from are cooked and cooled rice, cooked and cooled potatoes, and sweet potatoes. It appears that russet potatoes lose a little bit of their resistant starch when they're reheated, but in red and yellow potatoes, the resistant starch amount might actually go up a tiny bit when reheated after cooling, which is kind of cool. White-fleshed sweet potatoes have more resistant starch than orange-fleshed ones, but adding a little bit of lysine to your orange-fleshed cooked and cooled sweet potato can increase the resistant starch level by 20%. Weird. I only eat cooked and cooled purple sweet potatoes because I want those polyphenols, but I have no idea whether they have more or less resistant starch than orange ones. Cooked and cooled steel cut or old-fashioned oatmeal are also good options. Cooked and cooled legume beans have some resistant starch. One source I found said that white beans and kidney beans have the highest levels, but another source I found said pinto beans have the most. Joel Green always recommends black beans and garbanzo beans, which is what I usually do because I like them better. Canned beans have been cooked and cooled before they got to you. Cooked and cooled lentils and pearl barley have some resistant starch, as do cooked and cooled green peas, but those are nasty. I hate peas so much. I don't think you should be looking for more opportunities to add these to your life, but just for the sake of completeness. Traditionally prepared artisanal sourdough bread has a bit of resistant starch, as do corn tortillas and cooked and cooled pasta. You could also replace a bit of your flour when baking with green banana flour. I've been doing that for 10 years or more. Plantain flour, cassava flour, or potato starch also. Also, jicama has a little bit of resistant starch. I love a good jicama stick. One of the things I think Joel Green does a good job of explaining is how you're never just eating a single food or a single meal. I mean, obviously you are, but what you eat now will influence what you eat next. If you eat eggs for breakfast instead of a bowl of cereal, you'll naturally eat less at your next meal. If you eat resistant starches with your lunch, you'll naturally be more sensitive to insulin, which is a good thing, for the rest of the day. Resistant starches in your evening meal might help you be less hungry the following morning. Not to mention that a great deal of our experience of life, like how we feel and our ability to detoxify ourselves, whether we're sensitive to certain foods, how much toxins affect us, what we're able to absorb, even the presence or absence or severity of autoimmune diseases, all comes from the instructions in our non-human genes. The bacteria in our gut contain 100 times more genes than our human DNA does, so we really are better off if we eat for our bacteria than for ourselves. Starches have been largely vilified recently, but I think there is good reason to include them in a few meals a week. What's an easy way you think you might incorporate some resistant starch foods into your diet? Cooked and cooled steel-cut oats is a super easy and delicious meal prep. Put them in individual bowls, mix in a scoop of vanilla protein powder, and top them with a bunch of blueberries and blackberries and a little monk fruit and cinnamon. Yummy. Joel Green's books have tons of meal ideas, and one of the resistant starch ones that at first sounded a little weird to me is that you just mix some cooked and cooled sweet potato with some cold black beans, raw chopped onions, plus or minus asparagus or green beans, with a little fresh salsa on top. It's actually really good. I add chicken breast and cilantro if I have some. I eat it cold, but you could warm it up. It's super easy and actually really good. It's so easy to bake a couple of sweet potatoes one day when you're in the kitchen anyway. I like to keep a little extra diced onion and cilantro on hand anyway because it just makes my life easier. Then later, you can get 3 or 4 containers, distribute the cooled sweet potato among them, open a can of black beans, add a little bit of diced onion and cilantro, maybe some green beans or asparagus to each container, and pour in a little salsa. Easy peasy. I love the Trader Joe's cooked chicken. I eat it plain like the way some people might eat a handful of crackers. My kids will verify this. They're like, so you're just eating a baggie of chicken? Yes, I am. It's the best kind I've found. So if I have some of that, I throw that in there too. You could also add some jicama for a little crunch, whatever's easy. I'm sure you could come up with some other easy and delicious lunch ideas. Roasted and cooled, then reheated potatoes. Salad with garbanzo beans, cooked and cooled lentils or pearl barley. Cook your rice ahead of time and then let it cool. Then reheat it with your lunch. Tons of possibilities. I hope understanding the positive role of resistant starch has been helpful to you. Next week, we're going to consider whether gamification can help us age better. Until then, enjoy eating some starches and don't be normal. Thank you so much for tuning into the Health Courage Collective podcast. I am truly honored that you have paid me the enormous compliment of your time and attention. I would be so grateful if you would share this podcast with someone you know and subscribe so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for entertainment and information purposes only. Statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Christina Hackett and producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse events by use of information contained herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.
Fentanyl. It could be hiding anywhere, including in your house, including in your medicine cabinet, or maybe at a friend's house when you're hanging out, playing games, and get offered a pill. Don't take chances. If a drug didn't come from a pharmacy directly to you, you can find fentanyl using a simple strip you can pick up at your local pharmacy. Don't take it until you test it, because fentanyl can be hiding anywhere. Brought to you by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Mental Disabilities.